podcast. Welcome to GreenZone with the Adams, Adam Lang and Adam Kahn. Joining us today, we have special guests Matt Hufflefinger and Steve Wood. Today's topic focuses on what you need to know about the strategy for the edge and how to break it down and minimize risk to prepare better for litigation. As a note, we'll be answering questions at the end of the session, so feel free to put in your comments, your questions in the comments section, and then we'll answer it near the end. And then we also have, if you like this topic and you want to learn more, we have an upcoming webinar, and we'll give you details at the end of the event as to how you can get added to the list to join that particular webinar and register. So at this time, Adam, I'm going to hand it over to you and do more formal introductions for our special guests and get the conversation started.
That's awesome. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of The Two Adams. I'm joined with Adam Lang and myself. Super excited about this session here. As everyone in their job has side hobbies, this is one of my side hobbies, is to really understand how plaintiff attorneys are going after our customers, the commercial fleets. And I know, Adam Lang, that you saw this article about the edge, and I think every time we've spoken since, you've mentioned it. So I think we're going to kick off this webinar in tradition. I think the last time we talked about who we thought was going to win the Super Bowl, and maybe some of us were right. Others, like myself, who hitched my wagon to the Browns in the playoffs, I was greatly disappointed. Maybe we can do a little introduction today with we're just about ready for the first pitch of the season. So maybe baseball predictions. If you have a favorite team or you think someone's going to win the World Series, why not start it off that way? But Adam, maybe I'll pass the baton to Steve, and then Matt can say hello, and then you and I can move into the conversation. So Steve, why don't you go ahead and say hello to everybody?
Yeah, sure. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. Thanks to both the Adams for having us on. Thanks for Matt as well, and including me on this conversation. And as far as my World Series pick, I'm going to have to go with the Dodgers. It's not a sexy pick probably, but they're loaded up and stacked. So I'm going to be interested to see what happens with them this year.
Good pick.
Awesome. Good pick. All right, Matt, the pressure's on you now.
Well, I'm in Peoria, Illinois, and of course, Peoria is split between Cardinals and Cubs, but I bleed Cubby Blue, so I got to go with the Cubs for 24.
All right, and Adam Lang, why don't you say hello real quick, and then I'll wrap it up with my prediction.
All right. So hi everyone. I am a diehard Minnesota Twins fan. Love them through every season. Had a little bit of encouragement with them last year, so I'm going to go with the Twinkies.
All right. Well, I'm a homer, so I will hitch my wagon to the Padres, making it into the playoffs as a wild card, and then being cagey for maybe get an upset or two and go to the dance. I think they have enough horsepower. So, it's easy to cheer for the home team. So I will hitch my wagon to the Padres this season. So let's jump into this a little bit, because I myself and I think Adam, between us, we probably have 50 to 60 years of, call it, safety transportation experience. Adam on the carrier side, me on the supplier side, and I've been definitely focused on kind of the evolution of plaintiff attorneys, how fleets have been responding to their tactics, and I'm very, very interested in. Very much as the trucking industry continues to learn about how to defend against, I know the plaintiff attorneys, they have their own trade shows and they have their own working groups and symposiums to figure out how to win. So everyone likes to win in court. And maybe, I certainly would like to learn more about the elements of the edge, because we've gone from binary data to support a crash to some limited video to, I'll call it vision-based video now, like, with Driver Eye has. But, the plaintiff attorneys themselves, they've changed also, right? They don't like to lose. So maybe Steve or Matt, maybe you can, step into the reptilian theory and maybe give an introduction about the edge, where the industry's headed or is already there.
Yeah, I think maybe Steve would be, the one thing about Steve's involvement versus someone like myself as a lawyer, he's dealing with it every day. And we deal with it in pockets. And obviously I'm very familiar with it, that he's dealing with it every day. So I'd kind of like to hear from him. And then I can talk about a lot of our experiences involved in preparation of witnesses and having them testify both deposition and trial.
Sure, yeah, I'll kick it off. I think obviously this is going to be a high level discussion of the edge, and they like to keep a lot of the secret sauce hidden. So this is a lot of things that I've gleaned over the years of reading depositions and listening to podcasts and all that. So, but I think first and foremost, what you need to understand that their approach is about is focusing on the actions of the defendant. So, you hear a lot of edge attorneys when they're talking to each other, if they're going and someone says, hey, let me tell you about this case I have. And if the first thing that comes out of their mouth is a discussion about, listen, I have this plaintiff who was in a car accident, they now are paralyzed, then that edge attorney immediately knows that they're not with the program. So the first and foremost is let's focus on the actions of the defendant. So from a trucking industry standpoint, what did the trucking company not do? Okay, I got this trucking company who had someone that they hired and didn't go through proper training, and then they didn't have proper oversight, and they didn't have them doing this, and they didn't have them doing that. So it's a big buildup about what the defendant didn't do or did do. And then afterwards, after they've kind of focused on all that, then it's like, okay, now let me tell you what happened to my plaintiff. But the big buildup on the front end is more or less the actions of the defendant. And that's the first thing. And then it really goes to this kind of concept they have. There's a couple of them. And, we talk about it in the article. They call it, spreading the tentacles of danger. And what that really is all about foreseeability. So a lot of it goes to foreseeability, meaning, the trucking industry, they knew this was an issue. They knew there's a potential that someone could be injured, and they didn't do anything about it, right? They knew that their trucks are bigger, harder to stop, harder to steer. When they hit something, it can cause more damage. But guess what? They didn't go through the training necessary. They didn't do the things that were necessary in order to keep the motoring public safe. And then, of course, their plaintiff becomes a foreseeable victim. And it also leads to the fact that other people in the community are now foreseeable victim as well. So that's one of the other things they focus on. And then last, and I'll kick it over to Matt to kind of fill in that too, is we're talking about system failures. All right. So and it's something that jurors can relate to, because everybody's job has a system in place, whether it's physicians have a system in place for pre-op, whether it's pilots have a system in place in order to make sure they go and check all the instruments and wings and all that before. Well, the trucking industry has a system in place too, right? Your pre-trip inspections and a lot of other things that you're doing. And what happens is when bad things happen, they look for the system failure. They look for the thing that went wrong, the pre-trip inspection that didn't get done, the training that didn't get done. Where did the system break down? Where was the failure? And then we can tie that system failure to what happened to their client. So those are the things they're really looking for when they're trying to build up a case, is where can I find these areas that I can build my case around?
Yeah, and I would add that obviously the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations are fertile ground for setting the table for all these accusations of system failures. And the thing that they're doing is they're following up on what Steve just said. They're breaking things down into minutia relative to saying this one particular action would have prevented the accident. And I think that my feeling is that when we're preparing people to testify, we need to focus on there are many things that happen in running any business, particularly a trucking company. And so we need to focus on who we are as a company, who they are as a company, along with their safety culture. And I think safety culture is extremely important. And I would emphasize, there's a great article from ACTRI, the American Transportation Research Institute, back in 2015, talking about the importance of culture of safety and preventing, commercial motor vehicle accidents. And I stress that because to me, when you're in this setting, in terms of optics and the things that the motor carrier and the driver, himself or herself can testify about, culture of safety speaks volumes, particularly in front of a jury.
I think one other ththing I want to build on that too, Adam, that I want to touch on is I think I'd be remiss if we leave this without getting something straight on the record about the edge and misconceptions about the edge from the defense perspective. The goal is not to scare jurors. Okay, so if you're out there saying the goal of it is to scare jurors, you're incorrect. The manual says you're incorrect. The plaintiff attorneys would say you're incorrect. It's not to scare jurors. You need to understand that it's to empower jurors, because they are now defenders of community safety, and it's their job to protect themselves, protect their future generations. And they can do that by righting a wrong, by giving the plaintiff money, by righting a wrong. And then they go home feeling good that they've made a change. They've made a difference in the industry. So when we talk about, like I said, it's not scaring jurors. You have to think about it from a perspective of they're building them up to make them feel good about the decision they're about to make in the deliberation room.
It's interesting you bring up the safety of culture, and I call it the promotion of culture. And one of the things that I've kind of changed my position over the years, as a product deliverer of safety solutions. I'm always interested in customers, doing a press release and saying, hey, we bought Netradyne Driver Eye. This is great. And, we look good in the press. But I've actually I've had a pivot on that to where I'm actually advocating for new customers to promote the fact that they've invested in safety and make it, start to develop a public record. Because to your point, Matt and Steve, as you're talking to the jurors, if the only story they're told is from the plaintiff attorney, it's not, someone else is telling the story. You're not the hero of that story, right? Any story that you ever tell yourself, you're always the hero of your own story. So it's always interesting. We've started to kind of work with our prospects and our customers to say, don't tell the world that you bought Netradyne. Tell the world that you've invested in safety and that this is important to you, because hopefully in court, the jurors might recall an article they saw about your company and the good things you're doing in the community and not have that pre-bias. So it's certainly on mind. Do you feel like that's useful, or does that have any kind of impact into this process, or, with the jurors?
I'll respond to that. I think that's a great point, Adam. And it's enormous, because, one of the things about the plaintiff's lawyers, they don't really want, getting back to what Steve just said, they want to focus on one small area that they think, resulted in, they didn't do this and this caused the accident, that caused, someone to suffer, catastrophic injuries, or multiple people lose their lives. They don't want to really talk about, the company as a whole, how it functions, all the different things that have to happen for that company to function well, all the mouths that company feeds, right, in terms of its employees, as well as us, the general public, in terms of if they're transporting, food or other goods. I mean, look, it said 74% of all goods are transported by the motor carrier industry. So these things are important. And I think it's, the other thing I always tell my people when I'm preparing them, no one's going to ask the truck driver to, hey, tell me about yourself. Tell me what kind of person you are. Tell me how good a person you are. What you like, what you don't like. No one's going to ask the company, hey, talk about the company. It's a multi-generation business and, has this family atmosphere. They don't want to hear about those sorts of things. And so to me, that's extremely important when you're preparing these people, when you're working with someone like Steve to prepare them to testify, that you're teaching them, to create their own narrative, to personalize themselves as well as the company, because they're not going to be asked those questions. And then, and then on top of what you're saying, or adding to what you're saying, Adam, is this culture of safety is enormous. Being able to say that, you've actually coached your drivers regarding certain activities, whether it may be personal conveyance, hours of service issue, not logging something properly. Those things are important. And then, and showing that that's been documented, right? There's so much electronic data available, to the plaintiff's bar in terms of how how motor carriers function, and looking at scorecards and all these different things. But, you have to dig trying to figure out, what is our narrative? What is our story? How do we want to package this all together? And having a motor carrier that can talk about its safe practices in front of the jury, when you get back to what Steve said, when the plaintiff's counsel is trying to basically, make the motor carrier out to be the villain, right? And you have to, it's your job to soften that, that approach and try to personalize that company, personalize that driver. And, I think that's extremely important. And we have a tendency, the other thing I would say this is that we have a tendency in defending these cases to be somewhat, we're always defensive minded. We're always defending, right? We're the pursuit. And I think that you have to have an offensive mindset here.
Yeah.
You kind of have to, when you're defending, you have to have a mindset of attacking as well, if that makes sense.
100%.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because so I knew my relationship with Adam Lang has spanned a couple years now, and so I knew Adam before he worked at Netradyne when he was with a commercial fleet, and then now I know Adam after he's worked at the commercial fleet at a solution provider, and I wonder, Adam, if we can, you're still being called for depositions, and it's interesting. Just in our conversation here, I wonder, and I already know the answer, if your depositions as a fleet person versus somebody from the I call it the solution technology side has changed the way that you kind of approach this, as being a witness or as someone being deposed.
Well, my deposition background just in general was I wouldn't say robust, but pretty solid. I'd been called to give statements several times throughout my career. But what has changed is this, and I have to apologize about my voice. I'm fighting a cold here, some crud in my throat. So if
we may have to get an AI bot just to over like a vocal over.
Please don't.
Yeah, we'll fix that in post processing. We'll put a nice some vocal fry and all that.
Well, post processing doesn't exist when it's a live event, but I appreciate that, Adam. What has fascinated me over time in trucking is how we've had these targets on our back for a very long time, and yet you don't hear about it as much in other industries, and that might be because those industries aren't as fragmented as trucking. It's very interesting to me that about 90% of the trucks on the road are belonging to fleets that are 5 trucks or less. So the industry in itself is fragmented. The very large carriers, you would think they have the lion's share of the business out there, but in truth, the really, really big carriers have only a very small fraction of the total trucks out there. So we're a fragmented industry, and I think organizations like the Truckload Carriers Association, American Trucking Association, state associations, legal associations that Matt and Steve both belong to, have been kind of working on strategies to fight this attack that comes at us. But not every trucking company belongs to an association, even the smaller ones. And ATRI just did a really nice study. It was probably 3 or 4 months ago about a correlation between accident experience and claims versus the amount of time they spent with industry associations. I might not have gotten that perfect, but there was a positive correlation with industry association and safety. So gathering as much knowledge as you can, I think is very, very important too. And listening to your counsel. As long as you have good counsel, listening to your counsel and doing what they tell you to do. Don't ignore it. You're paying them to be there and to defend you. So it's very, very important that you practice and you coach with them as much as possible.
So let's do a little role play here, Adam. And I'm going to use the Adam Lang 5 years ago with that luscious dark beard. And I'm going to use Adam Lang with the current beard.
Okay.
Steve and Matt, if I have a 5-year time horizon difference between Adam Lang as your star witness from, Phantom Trucking, CDL, safety director, all that, what might be the approach to prep Adam 5 years ago versus today? What are the delta, the differences, the new strategies for cross-examination that you might prepare Adam that you didn't do 5 years ago?
I mean, I think there's probably some similarity across the board as far as, prepping from 5 years ago. I think one of the things that we don't see a lot of lately is this whole unnecessary risk, needlessly in danger, all that type of language that you used to see with the reptile manual that basically just screamed to the witness, reptile theory, reptile theory. So I think you're seeing a little bit more subtlety as far as that goes, where there's a lot more focus on safety rules, and you have two options and you should always pick the safest one, right? Or you must do what's safest for the motoring public. So you're hearing a lot of that type of hot button safety, risk, danger, harm questions that are still occurring. So, I think one of the things about prepping Adam either way is really about understanding why the questions are being asked, why, if you say yes, it's A, bad for the case, but B, not intellectually honest, because a lot of those questions, the answers are not yes, even though psychologically, socially, we want to feel like the answer needs to be yes, but it's not. So just getting to understand why it's not a yes, and then understanding when they're saying responses that they understand why they're doing it. Because what I don't want is a witness to go in there and feel scripted and have to say, okay, gee, I got to remember this question came up. It was worded this way. What are the exact words I'm supposed to say? Instead, we need to be teaching the witnesses to understand why they're saying what they're saying. And I think that helps alleviate some of the stress and allows them to answer more truthfully.
Yeah, no, that's definitely helpful. And Matt, any additional comments here, Matt?
Yeah, a lot of different thoughts, questions, what I'll say. You're working with someone like Steve to prepare people to testify is a process, and it's a very healthy process. I will say this: I personally think that the most difficult witness, probably that you as a lawyer, in terms of preparing them to testify well, is a truck driver. The truck drivers are, typically they think they're just going to be talking about an accident, and these things that are thrown at them as part of that preparation process, are very foreign to them. They're very Greek, and they really don't understand what's happening. So the point is, it takes a while to prepare them properly to testify. There's a process. You just don't. Steve and I aren't meeting with people the day before. We're meeting with people well in advance. We're trying to figure out who these people are, how they're going to testify, what are their, what are their tendencies, and all these different things. And so, there's a process, and it works. The thing I will say is, 5 years ago versus today, it seems like we've had this significant, move in terms of, we're hearing about larger and larger numbers being, thrown out there by juries. And so the process of involving someone like Steve in deposition preparation has taken on tremendous meaning. The other thing I would say is that, to me, the other thing is I would stress this. It's important that the client invest in Steve Wood. Okay. That's extremely important that they invest in him and his expertise. So that becomes a part of the team in terms that we utilize for purposes of preparation. I personally believe in, back 5 years ago, it would have been all in person. Now I think you still have to have in person, but you do a little bit in person. Maybe you do, some virtual, and you got to figure that out with each individual. But I think, there's a lot more at stake in today's world. The other thing I would say is, we have to, I'm big on this. We have to pay attention to the driver manual. I'm a believer that there should not be a driver manual. There's nothing in the federal regulations that say there has to be a driver manual. And you talk about what you see in the driver manuals are I'll call it a generational document. And there's all these, they're prepared with great intention, but at some point they lose any meaning. And then all you've done is created your own rules that now all of a sudden you're violating your own rules. And you want to get a jury upset as you have these rules and you violate them, right? So it gets back to what I was saying earlier about having more of a culture of safety, that we don't have a driver manual, and and you focus on training and coaching versus having a piece of paper. The other thing is that, it's like I did this presentation last April for a client, and there were people from underwriting on. They're like, "Oh God, we gotta have a driver manual. Somehow that's a badge of safety, right?" And it's just like, no. I mean, you have to look at different metrics. The driver manual, many times those drivers aren't even going to read the driver manual, right? And so you have to look at different metrics when you're looking to write, the coverage for that particular motor carrier, I think, versus a driver manual. I think driver manuals are meaningless. To me, you may want to have a few policies, but to me, it gets back to the importance of training. And then, when you're preparing people, and Steve's seen this. I mean, you're preparing people and they don't have that culture of safety, and how difficult it is to prepare those people to testify well. It's very, very challenging versus a company that does have a culture of safety. And that becomes their default, if you will.
Yeah, it's interesting on a personal level. We Netradyne, the state we're at, we're starting to have more of a public eye. And so a number of the executives just went through media training. And I only bring that up because my question is, what would your recommendation be for a fleet? So in my mind, there's 4 immediate things that a fleet can start doing today. One is, we talked about telling your story publicly, not waiting. The second one is practice. Don't start this conversation the moment you get a subpoena. Maybe twice a year do practice audits, mock trials. The third one would be to increase the active engagement with the driver, where we feel technology starts to do that with in-cab coaching. And then the fourth one, which I think is really viable and really important, is to cast the halo of positivity around the driver. As a presentation, say this is not a villain. In terms of the practice, what would your recommendation be for a fleet? Is it a once a year exercise to have a mock event where you like poking holes, or how would a fleet go about not waiting for the worst day possible to start, but maybe do something as a pre-training event?
So I think I'll start and then I'll kick it to Matt. I think one of the things Matt touched on, a lot of things in his answer previously that I thought were really, really good. I think the first thing to do is kind of look at your website, look at your marketing materials. So take all that safety as our top priority off your website. There's no reason for that, to have that on there. You have to start thinking like a plaintiff attorney. So if I have an event and I'm a plaintiff attorney and I go to your website, what am I going to find? And what am I going to find that's going to look like when I blow it up 10 foot tall and put it on a big board in front of a jury? So just starting to look at things with an eye towards, if something were to happen, how would this look to an outside observer? So that goes, like I said, to your media training, your front facing website, your policy and procedures manual, keeping in mind, do you have policies and procedures that are on the books that you don't follow? Well, why don't you have a couple of those policies and procedures on the book you don't follow, and see what happens during your deposition, and see what happens in trial when they say, look, ladies and gentlemen, jury, they have all these policies, but guess what? They don't follow any of them.
Yeah.
Let's hold them responsible, because they're obviously not holding themselves responsible. So, that would be one of the things. And then other thing, what I think would just really be going and doing a kind of a training session with your corporate representatives to get them to understand, so that they're ready, because they're going to get deposed more often than the drivers and that. So getting them ready for their deposition before you even have a case, I think is another thing. And I think one other thing, and going back to kind of what Matt said too, is I think it's important to understand, and I think everybody on this call does, that jurors, for lack of a better term, just have negative opinions of truck drivers. They have negative opinions of the industry. We hear it all the time. So I think one other focus is being cognizant of who you're putting behind the wheel and what they're doing on the road, because I think everybody has had an experience where they're driving down the road and they see a semi start drifting one way or the other, and they get nervous and they either speed up or they slow down and they want to get the heck away from the truck driver. You don't think that they don't carry those perceptions and those experiences and those attitudes into the courtroom? Absolutely. Everybody has it. So it's just being mindful of that and that perception that they're going to bring over. So I think those are the few things that I'll add that, build on what you had just asked there and what Matt had kind of said in his answer as well.
Yeah, I would add, Adam, I think it's important for the motor carrier to consistently, talk to its drivers relative to, how the company was formed, how the company started, and the formation of the company and how it started, obviously, carries forward even, into today, right? In terms of how they go about doing their business, their fundamental philosophies, the visions of the company, how they treat their customers, how they take safety seriously, and make that part of the core discussion that you consistently have with your drivers when you have driver meetings. I think that's extremely important. So, you're a larger motor carrier, obviously you're going to have more people. You're going to be talking to more drivers because you're going to have terminals in different spots of the country, but you have to have those systems in place to make sure that those things actually happen. And obviously, what are you trying to do? You're trying to create a sense of family, even though you may have several thousand drivers, but that's extremely important. The other thing is doing things, that, and I think I can't remember. I think it was Steve that talks about, maybe it was you, Adam, talking about positivity, right? Praising your drivers through social media, pointing out some of the successes of drivers in terms of their driving safety, things that milestones that have been achieved. I think those things are really important. Trying to create a positive image for the company and for the industry. I think that's a responsibility for us all, including me, the lawyer. I think that's extremely important.
I'm starting to see more and more YouTube, like monthly, weekly updates from carriers. We have one customer that does a monthly safety meeting, over YouTube, and they rewarded one driver. They pick a name out of the hat, and I think the driver gets a couple $1,000s, which is pretty exciting. I've seen another fleet on a monthly basis. They'll stand up and they'll talk about their accidents per million mile and what activities they're focusing on, and they're very I guess I'll wait and see if that strategy of transparency works. But if nothing else, that there's this record of them being very open and having an action-minded focus on safety improvement. So those are, I've seen more and more of those. What do you think, Adam, about the carrier point of view?
I really, just personally, when I see some of the items on social media where the carriers are having their meetings and they've got everybody on screen, they have health and wellness coordinators coming up there, they have safety directors, HR directors, different aspects of the business coming to talk to drivers. And for the drivers that aren't there in person, they might be able to pipe in and look through a tablet or a phone while they're not driving. I like it. I really like the fact that some of these companies are just being very upfront, honest, open. Like, anyone can look at this safety meeting. Anyone could look at this, whatever type of meeting you want to call it, a driver's meeting or just a come to Jesus meeting, whatever it is. I really enjoy the fact that these companies out there that are doing it are consistent with it and giving great information to their employees, their drivers, but also for the random person that doesn't understand anything about trucking, or maybe you're thinking about going to CDL school and getting your CDL and starting a new career, because in about 35 states, give or take, trucking's the #1 job. TCA put out some statistics about that a few years ago. It's surprising, but it's true. So I love the transparency. There might be moments where it would make me nervous still being in the industry, but overall, I like it. In fact, I jotted a note down to ask Steve and Matt the exact same question. What are your thoughts on some of these social media meetings that could be recorded and shown in depositions or in trials? What your thoughts are on that?
I'm going to kick it over to Matt, because I can imagine I got a little heartburn just thinking about that. So Matt, from the attorney's perspective, I'll let you start it off about how that feels.
Yeah, well, the thing about it is I defend one client that they have a lot of podcasts, okay, and it's available for all their drivers, and so what Steve's saying, we're like, oh, as a lawyer, like, oh my God, what are they going to use here, right?
Right.
But we can turn that around too, and kind of getting back to what you just said, Adam, about the transparency. To me, it's our job. It's a job of me and Steve working together to create the narrative that we want to create relative to that company. That's extremely important. And they're going to use maybe one or two little snippets from that stuff when there's all kinds of things being talked about. And so it's up to us to make sure that those people are prepared to address all that. Because again, it gets back to, if you have a defensive mindset and you're focused on playing defense, we're going to try somehow to justify that, couple little snippets somehow, versus looking at a big picture here and talking about, the culture of safety of the company, how the company interacts with its drivers, why it interacts with its drivers the way it does. Things are going to happen. I mean, how we behave as a company, we have our drivers, we have a lot of other people behind the scenes that are doing a lot of different tasks for the trucking company. So I to me, it's a delicate walk, but I think in the end, do you want to just kind of sit back and then wait for the bomb to explode? Or do you want to basically be someone that's out there, ahead of the curve, doing things that, not only advance the interests of the company, communicate well with the drivers, but also create a good public image for the motor carrier industry? I opt for the latter.
Yeah. And like I said, just adding on, I think Matt hit it on the head, just adding and becoming a deterrent too, right? Is meaning that you get to a point where plaintiff's bar knows, okay, these are my main targets. I think Adam, you had said along a while back about having the industry has a big target on its back, right? I think some of these motor carriers have a bigger target than others. And these attorneys are very coordinated and know, okay, I can go after these few companies because I'm just going to keep hitting and they're going to settle cases. I think, getting to and kind of what we're talking about here, the goal is to get to a point where you insulate yourself a little bit more against where plaintiff attorneys can go like a lotto machine or the ATM machine, they're just going to keep hitting you. I think all of that is good stuff with the mindset of going forward of we need to be a deterrent to opposing counsel.
Well, I just read an article not too recent about private equity companies funding some of the litigation because of the return on investment. So, there's no doubt there's a target list of private and public companies that certainly are have the high visible brands that have that perception. Adam, what do you think about from the carrier side or the point of view? What I'm wondering. I'm going to steal your question here, maybe.
Yeah.
So as I do official time clock on this, we're going to try to bring this home. But I'm thinking about from the one bit of advice that you might give to a carrier. Like what's the first thing that if you're not doing this, you're really you've got a big hole in your ship. What are there one or two things that should be now projects that some of our customer prospects and peers in the industry should be thinking about?
100%. I believe in as far as safety equipment goes, collision mitigation. Get collision mitigation on your vehicles as soon as possible. Get cameras in your vehicles so you can see what happened. And when you're selecting a camera, trial them. Look at different competitors. Don't just look at company A, company B, company C. I happen to prefer a certain brand of camera. I'm sure you know it. It's right under my name. But at the same time, just get something in there that can also recognize events and help coach the driver. And number two, do something with that information. Coach the drivers. Have your demarcation line of, okay, if you're scoring X, you might get one coaching session because your score is too low. But if you're at or above the fleet average, we're going to just kind of leave you alone until we see anything that's more severe, more concerning, right? And then tie that all in with training. What kind of ongoing training do you have? Offer on-site training if it's possible, and also offer online training for the drivers that are out there 25 days of the month. There's some folks that just are never going to see a terminal. So figure out ways to get them trained. And with that training goes along with a defensive driving course of some type. I'm a big fan of the Smith system. It's been around the longest in terms of an organized defensive driving product that's been offered. I believe it's the oldest one in existence. And it still holds true today when you talk about the 5 keys. So training and having the right safety equipment in your vehicle, I think is paramount. That's what I would say to a fleet.
Yeah, I'm gonna add something here, and then Steve and Matt, maybe you guys can fill in any other recommendations. So there's another topic that I've seen in the news, and it feels like it's an emerging topic, which is, to Adam, to your point, is when you order new vehicles and you're not putting the recent technology, or I'm hearing the phrase failure to equip as also being an attack strategy where, a fleet could have bought. I always tell a fleet that if they trial a camera system, they decide not to go forward, that's probably like the kiss of death, because you've consciously made a decision not to do something safer, and it might be used against you. But again, let me go to Matt and Steve here to, like, what are the 1 or 2, short, like, immediate projects that fleets must have, to start having a good foundation of defense.
Matt, I'll let you start it off.
No, that's fine. I would say this. I mean, first of all, I think investing in the technology is important. And, again, it gets back to optics, but it also just speaks to the fact that you're a safety conscious company, right? So I think that's important. I mean, most of those lawsuits that exist relative to you didn't have, tend to fail. I mean, there's no requirement that motor carrier has a collision avoidance system on the truck right now, but still, that's going to make the fleet safer overall. Those systems, work very well, at lower speeds and stop and go traffic stand and interstate. And you see a lot of rear enders that will be prevented because of the impact of the collision avoidance system in those settings. But the thing that I would emphasize the most is the importance of looking at your driver manual. Many companies have these driver manuals. They're terrible documents. Okay, and I hate to say it to be blunt like that, but it's true. It's true. And you may see, at the beginning of it, there's a story about the 3rd generation trucking business and how it started. It's all wonderful, and then as you get through, start page by page, it gets worse and worse, and then you're seeing statements regarding the responsibilities and obligations of our professional drivers, professional this, professional that, and so I think it's important that you look at your driver manual. We do this for a lot of motor carriers where we're looking at their driver manuals. We're rewriting the driver manual if they think they have to have one. There is a little bit sometimes a push-pull between, human resources and operations, if you will. So, you're trying to manage, that a little bit. But, I think you have to look to prepare a driver manual where you don't subject yourselves to, you broke this rule, you broke that rule, right? I mean, I've had cases where the driver manuals they're just awful, in terms of all the information that's in there. And I mean, the driver manual is the case for the plaintiff's lawyer. And so I think, a motor carrier has to be looking, paying attention to their driver manual. I mean, there's a tendency like, hey, this is our baby. It's like the security blanket. We don't want to let go of this. And the thing about it is there's a mindset shift where I advocate for, kind of getting back to what you're talking about, Adam, having that safety culture, doing the things that you need to be doing to actually be proactive, not reactive relative to the safety front, and let go so much of what's on paper, because your drivers aren't going to read that anyway. Very few are going to read that.
Yeah.
No, I think Matt's 100% correct. That would have been where I went to, is safety manuals, policies, and procedures. Look at them. Are they updated? Are they unrealistic? Are they setting a standard of care that you can't meet realistically? Because they feel good, they look good on paper, but they're going to be used against you. So checking those, like I said, updating websites. If you have outdated information, I just was working with the trucking company last week. I was going through kind of the corporate rep training, and I screenshotted some of the stuff they had on their website, and they all looked and goes, that's not accurate. That's not what we use. And it's like, but that's the front forward facing information they have. So starting to go through and just really taking a keen look at that. And I think goes back to what Adam said too, is training, and more training and then document your training, making sure that people are going through it, making sure that people understand it, and just being, dotting all your I's and crossing all your T's. So when it comes to it, you don't have to say, oh, we had this training, online training course they went through. Oh, really? Where's the sign-in sheet? Oh, well, here's the sign-in sheet. Oh, your driver didn't sign in. So you'd agree with me then that your driver wasn't there, right? Well, no, my driver was there. Well, his signature's not on here. Yeah, but he was there. You believe me, he was there. You just set yourself up for a situation where you have to, yeah, but, and they might have been there. It's just optically, it looks like bad. So I think those are some of the other things.
I at one point in my life, I was a big fan of, when I was running sales here at Netradyne, I had a sales playbook, right? And I think the moment that I hit save to edit, that for the first time, it was already outdated, right? And then the problem then you have is version control, and then any updates that everyone really see the updates. And so Matt, to your point, and Steve, to your point, I think it's a feel good, like check the box, but certainly even at Netradyne, we've looked at internally at the labeling of some events, how we had them labeled originally to how they're labeled today, because of that same question is, if this came up in court, is there a possibility it could be used against us with the current wording? And, if the answer is maybe, then you should change it. Right? Yeah. Forget about yes, because yes, like you already know the yes statements that need to be removed. But like if you're not 100% convinced it can't be used against you, there's a thesaurus, and go find other words to use to say the same thing. Like we have one customer, they did a press release, and it says we did this investment because we're investing in our drivers who are our best resource. Right? It's a creative way to say, hey, I want my drivers to be as productive, as safe as possible, without saying safety is my number one priority, right? So I think there's always great ways to say, those very positive things and get people engaged. So I think Brenda or Erica, if you're online, we are at 47 minutes. And I wanted to see if there's any questions that we have. I know that maybe we have one or two. But if there's anything else, Erica, you want to start with, if not, I can go to the one or two that I have that were pre-sent to us.
Yeah, just thank you guys. Appreciate that information. Yeah, if you have one or two that you want to start with, that's fine. And I'll just remind the audience that they can put their questions in the comments section.
All right, well, I'm just going to monitor that. Except for Jared Young telling us about Go Giants, which I'm assuming is the San Francisco Giants and not the New York Giants. We'll register that vote for the World Series. But so maybe Steve and Matt, I'll leave with kind of call it a final comment / question. What are your views on the future of the edge? Will attorneys continue to use this tactic, or do you foresee some additional evolution happening?
I personally foresee them continuing to use it. I mean, say what you will about plaintiff attorneys and that, they're very good. They're very well coordinated. They share information. I think you're really starting to see because really the edge kind of started around 2019. So you only have about 5 years of them kind of going with this current way they're doing things. But I think you're going to see a lot more. Like I said, I think now that they have several podcasts out there, I encourage anybody on the defense side, go listen to their podcasts. They have a lot of information that they're sharing. So I think you're going to see a lot of these attorneys start to continue to use it because it's successful. It works. And if you have defense bar, or if you have clients who are not prepared, who are up on it, who aren't doing the things that they need to do in order to protect themselves for it, they're going to walk right into these traps. Like I said, all the things we've talked about today, you can avoid all that foreseeability, all that systems failure by doing the things that can allow them to kind of sink their teeth into those. So I see it continuing, and I can see it continuing to get bigger.
Yeah, I agree with Steve. What I would stress is the one of these things, and I know Steve can attest to this, is what I'll describe as the opportunity cost of being involved in litigation, and how much time is spent away from say, our safety director and people that may be serve as that a person maybe serve as a corporate representative in that position setting, all the time that's dedicated to litigation versus running the company. And I think that is, getting back to, I think, Adam, what you were talking about earlier in terms of what a company could do. I think that's a very important topic, because to me, that serves as a deterrent, right? You don't want, I always say to them, hey, I'm going to own you at some level. I hate to say it that way, but I will, right? Or Steve and I are going to own you at some level, because there is going to be a lot of time and energy that we're going to spend together getting you properly prepared to testify. Yeah. And I think that is extremely important, and starting that process early and doing it often. Because it's, we've all had situations. I know Steve has, and I have as well, is that you prepare, and someone that just, when they just don't perform. It happens. But the bottom line is, for the most part, your preparation is good. It's valuable, and people start to figure out how they need to approach these topics that are brought up that really have, I always say these things that they're talking about, remember, they have nothing to do with the accident. Yeah. What are some of these questions? How are they related to the accident? I mean, to me, that's your cue here, that they're not related to the accident. They're trying to set up these meaningless safety rules that they ping then all the bad behavior, so to speak, quote unquote, against these safety rules that really have no meaning other than what they're trying to create for the narrative they have in the lawsuit.
Yeah. So in terms of information associated with the accident, we do have a question in the comments, and I'm going to read it because I think it connects with exactly what you were talking about here. So it says, I'm curious if employers should rethink having drivers complete post-accident reports for fear that information could be used against them in litigation. Is there pros and cons of that, do you see, in terms of documenting or over documenting or under documenting an event that causes problems either way?
Let me speak to this real quick, because I think it's an interesting question. Okay, and I'll start with this. First is the preventability determination, and I know one motor carrier that they handle preventability determinations like this. They allow the process of litigation to proceed. But when they're asked, did you make a preventability determination associated with the accident? Well, this is what the litigation is addressing. The litigation is providing, because the thing about it is, when we make a preventability determination as a motor carrier, we're looking solely at the conduct of the driver. Jury's never going to understand that, right? So I thought it was a rather creative approach to say, we're going to allow the setting of litigation to run its course before we make any such determination. So you kind of take that sort of way. When you're preparing a report post accident, obviously it's going to be prepared in the ordinary course of business. It's going to be a discoverable document. So the question becomes, how do you handle that? And I think that's an interesting discussion we could talk about for another hour. But I think it's one of these things that you have to be very careful how you go about preparing.
Part 2 coming soon.
Yeah. So I just think it's one of these things that it's dangerous. It's just like, oh God, many times these are done as part of the company practices and procedures, and many times there's maybe not involvement of a lawyer involved, but I think these are things that that have to be talked about.
Well, I think it gets into the conversation we were talking about, and Steve, I'm going to let you add here in a second about my personal journey of being media, doing additional media training. I think the cursory training that I've picked up and Adam Lang has coached me on is, driver gets into an accident, the first thing the driver should do is sit in their cab, get their paperwork ready, and stay put. Getting out and saying, I didn't see you, or, oh my God, what just happened? All that coaching of, maybe you're adding too much to the folder is definitely something that would reinforce the need for, say, hey, let's go like mock trial this, or mock, do an emergency, trial before, we have to go through it for real. So I think there's an interesting point there.
Yeah, I think, like you said, there's always have to be cognizant of the fact that it can be misconstrued and things can be taken out of context and all of that. So I think, to Matt's point, talking about how a conversation be had around it and being clear on what becomes discoverable, obviously is important. But I mean, as far as whether you should or shouldn't do it, I wouldn't really weigh in on that. I'd leave it to the legal mind on here on that goes. But I can see how, from a legal perspective, it could be used later, and like I said, misconstrued later on a he said, she said, or he said about what really occurred. So you open yourself up for any of that type of stuff.
Yeah, and I think it's probably something that's a good question for that pre-event training or that pre-event mock, and run that A/B test, right? So, that, I mean, it could be a very simple, you had an accident and the driver did workflow A, and here's what, based on those actions, here's, what the defense strategy would be. Or you can go through and say driver did workflow B, which is a different set of actions. And then, you can demonstrate the different defense strategies based on that. And one could be over amount of information. The other one could be under amount of information. And both of you are keenly aware and experienced that each one of those is not good or bad. It's just situational, and you have to kind of prepare for it. So,
yeah, and I think one thing to keep in mind too, though, is that people are people. Like, you can train and you can talk to your drivers about don't do this, don't say this. But I mean, once you're in the moment, though, we talk about amygdala hijack. If you're like, oh my God, and you did something wrong, or that you might potentially be at fault. I mean, it seems unrealistic to think that they're going to come out calm, cool, and collected. I mean, the human side is going to take over. So I think you have to be cognizant.
I think I had that yesterday. I think I had amygdala hijack yesterday. With the daylight savings and it feeling like a Monday, which it wasn't a Monday. I think I felt like I had amygdala hijack yesterday.
I think daylight savings was a few days ago. If you're having amygdala hijack now, something else is going on.
I get more. During daylight savings than like traveling, flying to India. Right.
So, I was always told, and I never took this advice, but a very smart attorney told me this once. And he said, if you're ever curious to see how it goes down in a trial, visit one. Go sit in court.
Yeah.
It's public. And I guess strategizing which case to go sit in, what's close to you locally, all that good stuff. I'm sure anyone that has a friend that's an attorney could advise them or tell them, hey, you might want to call this person and talk to them. This is how you find out what cases are on the docket for the day or whatever the term is. But would you say that's something that some of our viewers might want to check out, is just go sit in a civil case with trucking?
I always talk to witnesses prior to trial deposition. I always have them go with the attorney over there and just go into the courtroom and get a lay of the land so that they get a little less anxious. So I think that does make sense from those people who are going to potentially testify at trial.
Yeah. Yeah. So Erica, I'm looking at the clock and I'm going to be timekeeper here. And I think that we have Hollywood has already signed a contract for the sequel. I think there's a great part 2 that we can definitely engage in. But I do want to thank Steve and Matt. You guys are awesome, and I do appreciate you spending time with Adam. And hopefully this was fun. And we look forward to the part 2 coming soon.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I appreciate you guys all joining us, and hope you guys all have a great day.
Thanks, Erica.
Thank you so much.
You guys are awesome.
Thanks, guys.
Everyone.